This is Coop's Comedy Corner. Buckle up because it's funny as Coop's Comedy Corner.
Hey everybody, welcome to Comedy Corner second. So we had Jimmy Schubert on last week. We had a great show, and my guest today, I was thinking about it. I met him like 15 years ago. No, I met him in LA on Cooper Talk. He came in and did Cooper Talk, and then he actually did it by himself twice. He did it with Bill Masters once, and he did it with Bill Masters and John Heyman once. And he's like up there. It's like Wendy Liebman and him and Reed Diamond are all in the part. But he's a very, very talented guy. He was a great comic, great writer, Emmy winner, played football at Yale, defensive back, I believe. And he's a Cleveland Browns fan, which we got to talk about. And my guest is Steve Skrovan. How's it going, Steve?
Hey, Coop. How you doing? Nice to be here.
So I want to start off with the Browns. Because, I remember when the Eagles won the Super Bowl, you sent me a message on Facebook. You did something, you said, congratulations.
Yeah.
And now, what's going on in your mind? Because Deshaun Watson looks like crap. I mean, what's going on in your mind as a Browns fan?
They have made a terrible mistake. Although the last game, Watson gets sacked 8 times. So they've got offensive line problems right now. And their offensive line used to be great. So I don't know. The week before they won, but they had a drive killed by pre-snap penalties. And they just haven't come. I mean, they certainly have all this talent. And maybe it's just going to take them time to get it together. These preseasons now, are used, starters don't ever play, which I think is smart because it's a very rough game where people get hurt. So that may be showing for some teams like us.
Yeah. So, okay. So
that's my expert opinion.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I feel bad for fans. I feel bad for Buffalo fans when they don't win because I knew what it was like all those years as an Eagles fan not winning. And when it finally happened, your whole attitude changes and you're not a dick anymore. You're just you don't get mad over stupid. I'm like, oh, well, they got knocked out. But, we won 6 years ago. And I feel bad for the teams that really haven't won the Super Bowl.
Yes. Well, I experienced this with my Boston friends when they finally won the World Series. The Red Sox won the World Series in 2004. And then they won in 2007. And it was difficult for them to make that shift from we are perpetual losers or always disappointed, always getting screwed over to, oh, wait a minute, we're the champions. Because that was like a big shift. And so they still had some of that attitude of being the victims of something. And now Boston wins everything in every sport. So I have no sympathy for any sort of complaining they ever do about anything anymore.
Exactly. So I want to get to your career. How does a college... Me
too. I would like to get to my career.
Your college football player
at
an Ivy League school. How does a college football player at an Ivy League school end up getting into stand-up comedy?
Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, there are a couple of comics. I know there's a comic out here, and I forget his name, Ron Robertson, who played minor league baseball. But usually the people who become comics are the guys who were picked last on the team. That's why they became comics, and that wasn't me. I wasn't the last one picked on the team. I wasn't the first one picked either. I was the one picking the team. That was my childhood. And so I had really an idyllic childhood. I used to joke to my parents. I say, I wish you would have fucked me up a little bit more. I would have had a better act. And I had great parents. I had an idyllic childhood. I had nothing but achievement through school all the way through. And the reason I've often thought, why did I get into this? I think the reason I got into it, it was simply because I could. And I just was born at the right time. And I got into it in very early 1980. It was at the embryonic stages of what is known as the 80s comedy boom. And a club opened up in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, having said all that about my childhood, humor was greatly valued in my family. And my dad and I had uncles and who appreciated, who were always making jokes. My dad especially was kind of a role model for that, even though doing something like that would be out of his, opportunity. He didn't have the opportunity. But I bet that if our births had been switched and I'd been born in 1930 and he'd been born in 1957, he could have done the same thing because he had the chops. He was a raconteur. He knew how to hold court. The only commonality, let's put it this way, between my career in sports, which I'm still doing now, I'm still playing baseball and softball and basketball and all of that. My career in sports and my career in show business is that I just happen to be good doing things in front of people. That's the common denominator. I'm good at doing things in front of people. So I'm kind of a ham bone, a show off. And it's in sports as well as it's showing off.
Well, you said, okay, so a comedy club opens in Cleveland. Now what makes you go up and do an open mic? So I'm guessing it was open mics then. Was it Hilarities or was it?
No, it wasn't Hilarities. No. This was post-apocalyptic Cleveland of the late 70s, early, March 9th, 1980. A club opened up. It was in this old Greek restaurant in post-apocalyptic. It was when all those Rust Belt cities were going bankrupt and people were moving out and the downtowns were hollowed out. And this club was like this throbbing beacon of life in the middle of a kind of a desert of urban decay. And I saw a little ad in the paper, and I'd always done things like that. I mean, I had done a commencement speech at my college graduation, which was a humorous class history, and that had gone over very well. And all through high school, I'd done things like stand-up-y kind of things because, again, I wasn't afraid of being in front of people and speaking. And so it was like 9 months out of college. I was in the proverbial parents' basement, not knowing what I wanted to do. I just knew what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to go to grad school. A lot of my friends going to law school, going to business school, going to med school, or working at Procter & Gamble or Siemens engineering. And I didn't want to do any of that stuff. And I had some pretensions about being maybe a short story writer, submit things to the New Yorker or something like that. But I was 22 years old. I had nothing to write about. I had no life experience to write about. And so I'm in my parents' basement, kind of noodling around, listening to Stevie Wonder albums. And fortunately, I had some credit in the bank with my parents who were willing to tolerate this a bit because I had kind of made them proud all through my school years. So I had a little cushion there, but that cushion was slowly getting worn down. And this club opened up in Cleveland, and I started going down there, I remember in January 1980, as a customer and seeing people on stage who were not much older than I was. It was people like Bob Saget and Jimmy Alec, and actually some were younger than I was, like Dave Coulier and Mike Binder. And it was all guys at that time. And most of them were coming from Los Angeles. And I was sitting there and I just really enjoyed it and enjoyed how these guys could just get up there and command a stage and be up there for 45 minutes to an hour or something. Saget sometimes do hour and a half shows. And they had an amateur night. They didn't call it open mic. They called it amateur night on Sundays. It was Wednesday through Sunday, and amateur night was on Sundays. And it was kind of bring your own crowd there because they would vote on the winner of the amateur night by the audience applause. And so the idea was bring your friends who would applaud for you. And I went March 9th, 1980, and I brought 3 friends, a couple of friends from college and a friend of my friend, and put a little tape recorder in the middle of the table. And it was like a dark, dreary night. And there was no energy in the room. And it was like, I was terrible, but everybody else was worse. So I won the $50. That's what they'd give, and they would give a T-shirt for the best heckle of the night at the Cleveland Comedy Club. They actually encouraged heckling, and when I think about it, they probably set the local Cleveland comedy scene back 5 years by encouraging people to heckle. Because imagine you get people who've hardly ever been on stage, and they're screaming at you just to get a T-shirt. So I survived that, and then 2 weeks later came back with a whole different 10 minutes of material. You could do 10 minutes that long. And I got up, and this time it was kind of a full house, and it was a raucous crowd, and it was a hot night, and I was really good, and I got some great laughs. But there was another guy who was just telling old jokes, and he was very good at telling the old jokes, and he brought a lot more friends than I did, and he won the $50. So I had a good set, a much better set than I had before, but I didn't win. But as I'm leaving, one of the owners of the club was owned by 4 young guys who were like in their early 20s, like I was. And Dino Vince, who was really kind of the brains of the 4 guys and ran the club, he came up to me and said, we're looking for, local MCs. I'll pay you $35 a week to MC. And I thought, yeah, I'll do that. $35. I was making nothing before that. And I could go to the comedy club every week. And so began my comedy career in the middle of March of 1980. Was this promises, Wednesday through Saturday, and then I would probably MC the amateur night on Sunday for $35 a week. And then I couldn't think of anything else but trying to write jokes. And I thought, okay, maybe this is what I want to do. This is writing, but it's also performing. And 6 months later, I moved to New York.
What was it like moving to New York? It was funny you remember your first night. I don't remember the date of my first night, but I remember the first night I got on stage was at the Comedy Factory outlet in Philly. And I still remember I had a wife beater T-shirt on and a black blazer over it. And I had a good set. And, and what happens then is we have this in our mind. You have a good set and you're thinking, oh, this shit's easy. Thinking, oh, I'm going to be headlining. And, because you don't know. And you have that confidence because you don't know what work it takes. And then I went back the next week and I ate it so bad that I didn't show up for like 2 months. But it's so funny how comics will always remember that first set because it's a monumental thing.
I still have the tape. It's in my drawer. It's a cassette tape. I need to get it digitized. I'm looking for it right now.
Look at that Emmy. You got people. That's an Emmy right above them.
This is the tape.
Oh, wow. That's so funny. I found an old video of my act because the Comedy Factory outlet used to tape it. And I don't want to look at it because I also have my audition tape I used to send out. And I recorded it at the Anita Fletcher's Comedy Club in Richmond, Virginia.
Sure.
I did a feature set and I took my little camcorder and I set it up. And I should really go back and look at it. It's just so, I don't have a VCR anymore. So I
know both those clubs and I worked the outlet a lot. And I'm still in contact with Clay Geary, who ran it. And I always tease him about how much he salted the popcorn.
Everyone said that.
People, I'm sure most of the people, he was killing his audience with high blood pressure. But he was doing it so they would order more drinks because the popcorn was so salty.
It was. Everyone always says it. So now you get to New York. What is the scene in New York when you get there? Who are some of your contemporaries that when you started hitting the clubs? I mean, Belzer was probably before you.
Yeah, Belzer was like an established dude. What was interesting about getting to New York at that time, this is now September of 1980, was that this was before things really started to blossom in the hinterlands. There were these clubs like opening up like in Cleveland and Detroit and other large cities around the area. It wasn't just confined to New York and Los Angeles. And of course, San Francisco and Boston were kind of second cities, and Chicago were kind of second cities to New York and Los Angeles. So they had scenes. But what was happening when I got there, it was 3 clubs. The Comic Strip, which is still there on the Upper East Side on 81st and 2nd. Catch Rising Star, which is right around the corner on 79th and 1st. and then the Improv, which is 44th and 9th. And those were the three clubs. And, there was, places like the Duplex, but that actually didn't come later. That was more of a singers club. But anyway, it was those three clubs. And I went to the comic strip first, and I got on the first night. You pull a number. It was like a lottery. And I got on the first night, and it just so happened that the owner of the club, Richie Tinkin, walked into the club. He wasn't there every night, but he was there the night I was there, and he could, and I do my set, and he calls me over afterwards and says, you're raw, but I can tell you've had some stage experience, so I'm going to pass you, and you'll have to hang out, late at night and not get on and pay your dues and all of that, but you're passed. So I passed to the comic strip on my first try, and so that's the place I hung out, and I hung out with guys like, I don't know, I'll name names that the general public might not know, but they're really seminal to my experience. I met like Scott Blakeman, the late Hiram Caston, Stu Trivax, George Calfa. Eddie Murphy was not a star yet. Eddie Murphy was at the club. I didn't hang out with him, but he was, I saw Eddie Murphy bomb, if you can believe that, because nobody knew him. He was just auditioning for Saturday Night Live at that point. And he was, you could tell he was brilliant. He was a teenager. He was 19 years old. I was 23. This kid's 19, and he's got so much stage presence, so much chops. And he would walk up on stage with what looked like a glass of wine. It was probably cranberry juice because he was too young to drink. And he would do this bit, I remember, where he would get people to step on stage. He just kind of waltz on stage and take his glass and propose a toast. And he'd encourage everybody to raise their glasses. And he would just, it would take a minute or two to get everybody to raise and once everybody had to raise their glasses, he would say, "To Black supremacy." And then riff on, that laugh. And then, the white guy in the back, splashed this wine all over himself, and do all of that. But I watched this kid just take over the stage and command it. And, his stuff was very silly, but it was you could tell the talent was just oozing from him, his ability to do impressions and characters. And he did another opening bit, which he kind of stole from Dick Gregory. Dick Gregory used to go on stage in the mid-'60s in the height of the civil rights movement and riots, and he would encourage the audience, especially the ones in the South, to yell out the N-word at him just to get it out of their system, because I know you're thinking it. And that was actually the title of his autobiography. And that was what he did. And so Eddie would get up there. Now, this is 1980. This is like 15 years later. And Eddie would get up and he would say, "I want you to do this," to yell out. And people would be kind of uneasy. And he would count to 3. You go 1, 2, and then stop. Wouldn't let him say it and say, "I'm not going to let you do that." And I thought it was interesting, mostly in retrospect, that he was taking this bit that Dick Gregory did in 1965, 15 years, who was encouraging people to yell, "Get out of their system." And Eddie Murphy is going, "No, I'm not going to let you do it. You can't do it. I'm going to like spur that same kind of thing in you, but I'm going to cut you off." So 15 years later, that was the state of the culture and race relations, and that was another one of his opening bits. But Eddie was just beginning, and then he just took off. Paul Reiser was there, and Paul, I remember, he had all these bits about diners, and he would, he'd be up doing late night, and he's a very good-looking guy and funny, and the story was that another one of the comics, I remember him doing this bit about never knowing what he, never remembering ever buying underwear, that it was always just in the drawer. And then there's a story about how he gets this audition for a movie from Barry Levinson called Diner. And he went because another friend of his called him up and said, "Hey, let's go shopping." And Paul said, "Oh, you know what? I'm going to go buy underwear," because he'd done that bit. And so he goes, but his friend says, "But I got to stop at this audition first. So why don't you just come and hang out in the waiting room?" So his friend, and I think it was Michael Hampton Caine, as I recall, was the comic, the late Michael Hampton Caine, brought him into the office, and Michael went and did the audition, and then Barry Levins comes out and sees Paul sitting there. He says, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm just here with Michael." He says, "Come in." And so Paul goes in, he gets an audition without ever signing up. And he's perfect for this role that they want. It's like the sixth man in the diner scenario. And I remember like the night Barry Levinson's going to come in and watch Paul do stand-up. And I remember asking Paul, he won't remember this, but I asked him this, probably one of the stupidest questions ever. I said, "Are you going to do your diner material?" He goes, "What the fuck do you think I'm going to do?" "Of course you're going to do my diner material, you idiot." And he got that movie, and then he took off. And Jerry Seinfeld was also a comic strip act, but he had already taken off. Jimmy Brogan had gotten a TV pilot. He was already in LA. But then my home club ended up being, for the middle 80s, the Improv. And it was people like Rick Overton and Rich Scheidner and Kevin Rooney and Larry David would come back after coming out to LA to do this sketch show Fridays. John Mendoza, John Heyman, Ron Darien. These were all my friends there. And then I would hang out at Catch. And then Bill Grunfest opens the Comedy Cellar. The Comedy Cellar, which is also still around, and not only still around, but has expanded into Las Vegas, and it's got 3 venues in New York alone. Since the Improv's no longer there, Catch is no longer there, and many of these other clubs that had sprung up in the 80s were no longer there. So Bill Grunfest opens this club on the Upper West Side, and it's in some hotel conference room. It's got no vibe. It's got nothing, and it doesn't really last that long. And Dom Herrera tells him he wants to open up. He's looking for another place to open a club, and Dom says, "You should go to the Village. Go there." And so Bill takes his advice and scouts some places, and finds a place on West 3rd in McDougal called the Olive Tree, which is a Middle Eastern restaurant. They've got a cellar. And the owner, Manny, he makes a deal with him, and he opens the Comedy Cellar. It was one of the original Comedy Cellar acts, along with everybody else, at that time in those early 80s. And so I worked the cellar a tremendous amount too.
Now, didn't you do like 9 sets in one night? Weren't you like the record holder?
Well, I did 8. I thought it was the right. I think that has been surpassed since. I've heard a word that's been surpassed, but yeah, I did 8, which at least at that time, in my experience, talking to other people, was some sort of record. It was crazy. It was a crazy time where you could work all the time. And the other thing I'll mention about this at the beginning of the 80s is that you mentioned Belzer, and he was like a house MC at Catch. And when I first got there, being an MC was a primo position because you got $100 and everybody else got cab fare, which was $5. And then a bunch of clubs started opening in New Jersey and Connecticut. When I say clubs opening, that means there was a guy named Jerry Stanley, a guy named Jim Balatzos in New Jersey, a couple people in Schuler. I'm forgetting his first name.
John Schuler.
John Schuler.
The last laugh at the Brown Thompson.
Yes. And so they start booking these one night. So a restaurant would have a comedy night on a Tuesday or a Wednesday or Thursday. It was a way to fill the restaurant with people. And 3 comics would, take a car from the Improv that you'd meet at the Improv, go through the Lincoln Tunnel, and go on these gigs. And everybody would do a half hour, 3 comics. And once that started happening, you would make $55. I think Jerry paid 55, but Palacios paid 60. And I think Schuler actually paid 75. I think to get people to go all the way up to Connecticut, it took a little more. But once that started happening, people started making money on the road. And then the really good acts, that people had 45 minutes of material, started going to these other clubs in the bigger cities like Cleveland or Pittsburgh or down south. Then the MC position went to the lowest person on the totem pole, because all the acts were good. All the acts who had 20 minutes, a half hour, 45 minutes to an hour were making money. And within a couple of years, it was the rookies who were having to MC. And that became, that was a shift that I saw happen, where the MC was primo, and then the MC went to the lowest man because everybody else was out making money.
So when do you start doing TV though, right? I mean, because wasn't there all those shows? Were you on all those shows like Caroline, at the Improv?
Caroline's Country Hour, Evening at the Improv. Yeah.
What was your trend? I mean, what was that like? Was it easy for you to get them because you were a New York actor? What were some of the shows that that just dropped in your lap?
They all kind of dropped in everybody's lap. I mean, there was such a hunger for this that, and I attributed it, and nobody else talks about it this way. And most comedians you talk to, they talk about those 80s comedy boom days, and they'll talk about, there were too many comics, and that's what killed it. It was too much on TV, and people stopped going because they could watch it on TV, and they didn't have to go to clubs. And all of that is true to a certain extent, but all of that is not the core issue for me. I think the comedy boom of the 80s was a demographic phenomenon, where it was people from the second half of the baby boom, like from 1957 when I was born, which was the absolute peak of the baby boom, more babies born in that year than any other in recorded history until recently, I guess. And there were people our age who wanted to go out, and there were people who had venues who realized, this is a lot cheaper than hiring a band, for a lot cheaper than buying a disco ball and having to have a huge stage. You could have it on a little postage stamp in front of a fireplace in your restaurant. All you need is a microphone and a light. And so it became this grassroots phenomenon that was fueled because there was an audience. There was a demand for it. It wasn't this top-down thing where somebody had an idea, I'm going to put comedians on. It was, how am I going to entertain all of these people? And so I'm a part of that second half of the baby boom cohort. And there were a few of us who thought, okay, I'll step in front and entertain everybody. We all have the same frame of reference. We grew up on the same TV shows, the same mass media. And the reason it waned 10 years later is because the audience went away. And the audience went away because all those young people are out partying and filling the clubs without having to have a headliner. All you had to do is say comedy. You didn't have to say who it was. They didn't care because they were going out for a comedy night. And so 10 years later, people started getting married, having babies, staying in. Same thing with the comics. That's what happened to me too. I got married, had a baby, and that's why it waned. Not because television killed it or there were too many bad comics out there. There were comics out there because there was a demand. That's the economics of it. People.
And every city had like the cheap booker, and he would put like a guy who's been doing comedy all for like 2 years. Remember, I'm not gonna mention the guy's name, but he's like, Coop, you wanna close the show for me? And I'm like, well, what's it paying? He was 75. I go, dude, I make more than that to feature, and I don't have to do any heavy lifting. He goes, oh, well, such and such will do it. I'm like, yeah, well, this guy's been doing comedy for 2 years. He's not a headliner. And that sometimes, you're right about the crowd. But I think also that there was a lot of comics. But at one point,
there were a lot of comics because there was a lot of audience. The audience comes.
Right, there's a lot of work. So you could be a working act.
Whole thing that people, and because we have this myth about economics in general, that there are job creators. We have to protect job creators, the Elon Musks of the world. And these people are not job creators. Jobs are created by demand. It's always bottom up. If there's a demand, and then you have somebody who's clever enough like a Jerry Stanley or Jim Palazzos or John Schuler or any other, or Anita Fletcher, who ran some great clubs in the South and Richmond and Nags Head, who are good business people, then they take advantage of this demand that they see out there. They identify the demand. And then when the demand shifts, which things do, then, the whole thing contracted. But it set this foundation for all the great comics that are out there today working, because the good clubs stuck around. And the idea that you could have a career as a stand-up comedian became just a foundational premise. Because when I started, I didn't know where comedians came from. I thought they popped fully formed from the forehead of Johnny Carson. I didn't know that there was this kind of quasi vaudeville existing out there, and it was there because you had this huge bulge in the population that was looking for something to entertain them.
Now, did you ever want to get into acting?
I did.
Because I know you went to TV writing. What was your whole foray? I mean, what was your path to end up writing for TV? You did act. What were you acting in?
Well, I was in New York. I was doing everything I could, because doing stand up was in the evening. So I took acting classes and did scene study, scene work. I did commercial auditions, and I tried to audition for theatrical stuff every once in a while. But the main focus was stand-up, because that's where I was earning a living. And so and then I wrote sketches, comedy sketches. And in the mid to late 80s, I put together a sketch show of material that I'd written and called it Live Skro Acts on Stage. It was a parody of a gay porn theater with live sex acts on stage. It was Live Skro Acts on Stage. And I got some actor friends of mine together, and we rehearsed and put this sketch show on at a place on First Avenue called Who's on First. It was a little cabaret. And it was really my first foray getting my writing, aside from my stand-up, in front of audiences. And we just had a lot of fun doing that show. And Larry David came to one of the shows, and he didn't much like my show. He liked one of the sketches I did, but it gave him an idea that he could do a show like this, because he had worked on Saturday Night Live in 1984, 85, and never got anything on the air. Everything that as close as he got would get cut at dress rehearsal. And so he saw me put all this stuff on stage and thought, I'm going to try to do that just to see if I'm crazy, if my stuff is bad or good or not. And he created a show called The Bosun's Mate, which was the name of one of the sketches. And he got a bunch of actors together. One of them was an actor from my little troupe. And eventually I came into the troupe, and we did all these sketches that Larry wrote. Many of them cut at dress rehearsal Saturday Night Live, others that he wrote, in the moment. We put them on at Caroline's, which had then opened on 8th Avenue and 26th Street in Chelsea, and got great reviews, and a recording of it exists. It got recorded. And so I got to act with Larry in these scenes, along with a bunch of other people. Many of those sketches that he wrote were the seeds for future Seinfeld episodes. And I remember one in particular was about an answering machine, leaving a bad answering machine message. And there's a classic Seinfeld episode where George leaves a bad answering machine message, and he needs to sneak into the girl's apartment to flip the tape out and claim the message, or else, and it's a very funny little caper story. In the sketch version of that, it was a trial scene where Larry is on trial in this relationship court, and they play the tape, and it's a very, icky tape of him, leaving one of those bad messages we've all left that we regret and wish we could retrieve. But that was that. So that's the kind of stuff I was doing and other people were doing to kind of exercise all these different muscles. So I was acting. I even took some singing lessons, because I have a decent voice, And I thought maybe if I could audition for musicals. And so for a couple of months, I took some singing lessons um, and commercial auditions, doing all of that. So I did the whole panoply of show business kind of activity, and writing was a big part of that. And what happened when one of my breaks was getting a job hosting a television show on MTV in 1988. It was when MTV, which had previously just shown videos, was just now branching out into original programming. And they had this game show called Remote Control with my buddy Ken Ober. And in fact, the reason I was in Larry's show is because Ken was like one of the lead actors in Larry's show, but then he got remote control and couldn't be in the show anymore. And so Larry asked me to replace Ken in The Bosun's Mate. So Ken getting remote control actually helped me eventually get Seinfeld because Larry knew my work. But I got the show on MTV. It was a talk show. And from that, it lasted about 6 weeks. And some of the people I hired on that show as my writers were Michael Patrick King, who's the Sex and the City. He was just Michael King back then. Scott Carter, who became Bill Maher's producer on Politically Incorrect in real time for 2 decades or more. Mike Rowe, who has won Emmys for Futurama and done a lot of other great TV work. And my good friend John Heyman, who's just still on was on the last season Curb Your Enthusiasm. I worked with him on Seinfeld too. And so I think what happened was the 80s comedy boom turned into the 90s sitcom boom, because now everybody was hiring comics to front their television shows, whether it was Roseanne or Jerry or Tim Allen, or, it seemed like everybody was getting shot. Every comic was getting a shot at a show. But not everybody could be, like I was not somebody who really lent himself to be a good lead for a comedy character in a show. Ray Romano. That's why I was mainly hosting shows. That's what I was good at, hosting. But the only few people could be the stars of the shows, but the rest of us had to write for them. So just like there's a whole huge population out there and some of us had to entertain them, 10 years later, when the comedy boom wanes and all these comics are doing TV shows, those of us who had all the other stand-up comedy training are now writing for them. And that's how I got to write for Jerry and got to write for Ray.
What was the process? You were with Seinfeld for 1 season, right? And you wrote the movie theater with the movie episode with Masters and Heyman,
right?
Okay, so what was it like in the? I was looking at your. If you want people go to Steve Skrovan on Substack, and you hear a story about his red soccer shirt, and you said there wasn't a writer's room, so you guys were just out there. Because most times, there's a writer's room. I'm sure Raymond had a writer's room. I'm sure it was you and Capobiano and Mike Royce, and all those guys in the room. What was the atmosphere like on Seinfeld? Why wasn't there a writer room? You said you were just there to generate ideas.
Yeah, we Larry hired me and John Heyman and Bill Masters and Bob Shaw, all comics that he knew. We all worked at the Improv, and it's because Larry wanted to write all the scripts, because he was very particular, a very particular voice, and he was looking for people to generate ideas and premises. And so he hired us as kind of this think tank, and they had to make up a title for us called program consultant. And so the 4 of us kind of shared an office together and would just talk all day, riffing and trying to come up with ideas for shows, for episodes, but just 1 or 2 lines. That's all Larry needed. And once he thought that was a good idea, he could go off and write it. And it was my first writing gig, and I didn't anything I contributed on that show that year was pretty much by accident. I felt like I was more auditing a master class than I was actually contributing to the show. But there was the four of us, there was Larry Charles and Peter Melman, and then Larry and Jerry. That was my year. Every year was different. But our year was a very social year because the four of us, even though we were the low people on the totem pole, we were actually the social center of the group because Larry would come in from his office, Peter would come in from his office. The best description I've heard of working on Seinfeld was from my friend Fred Stoller, who worked as a writer on the show 2 years later. And he said it was like a detective's precinct office where everybody's in their cubicle working on their case. And every once in a while, they go into the sergeant, who is Larry, or the captain, who is Larry. And he'd say, okay, follow this lead and follow that lead, and then come back. And then you do your thing and shove your outline under the door, which was Larry and Jerry's office. So, and I was explaining this to actually Tom Caltabiano on his podcast the other day. It's mainly because Larry is essentially introverted, and working in a room with other people is too distracting for him, and he doesn't get energized by it. He gets weary with that. Whereas Phil Rosenthal and Raymond, Phil's an extreme extrovert, loves the writer's room, loves, can take in all this information and sort it out and not get overwhelmed by it. And so the writer's room is always dependent on the personality of the showrunner. And in Larry's case, he was introverted. So that was kind of an introverted writer's room. We all had lunch together. It was all a lot of fun. And it was just different.
I don't want to get you upset, but I know when you were on my show with Heyman and Masters, you talked about how Larry wouldn't put an idea of yours on, or Kramer on top of the car or something like that.
Yeah.
And I could tell you were pissed. What happened? What is that story? Because it's cracking me up because those guys are giving you a hard time about it.
Well, yeah, we had, this is pre-OJ. This is 1992, 93. And I remember we were watching a slow speed chase, those things they have in LA.
Right.
Where
I missed them.
Somebody who's going like 55 miles an hour, and they're just, they're staying behind him. They're waiting for him to run out of gas. It's nothing like the real, the movies. And remember, there was some slow speed chase going on at the time. And Bill and I kind of took that idea and combined it with an idea that Bill had where, an experience that he had where he was at some ATM and some guy snatched a woman's purse and got into his car and started driving away. And Bill played the hero and got in front of the guy's car because as he was pulling out, and the guy doesn't like ram into him. He's just keeps going. And Bill finds himself on top of the hood of the car, and the guy drives for a block with him on top of the hood of the car until he stops and Bill jumps off, and that was that. So we thought, what if that happened to Kramer? He's trying to be a good Samaritan. Somebody gets the purse snatched. He gets on the car, but instead of the car stopping and getting off, it just turns around and goes through the Lincoln Tunnel, and there's a low-speed chase with Kramer on top of the car. And that was just one thread of the story. We had other threads of the story. And what's funny about that story, and forgive me if I'm repeating this, that we did this on your other podcast, but Bill and I put that story together with a couple of other threads because you had to have 4 threads in every Seinfeld episode at that time. And we're going to pitch it to Larry, but Larry's sick that day. And he was like, oh, this is unprecedented. He was like the Iron Man. He was like, Lou Gehrig, Cal Ripken. He was never sick. He's never out. But he was renting an apartment in Studio City, not far away from the studio. And he said, come pitch it to me here. So Bill and I drive to this rental house that he's staying in. It's got, bare bones furnishings. And he's literally on the couch with a blanket that barely covers him on the couch with a cold or something. And he says, if I have to get up and go to the bathroom, don't take that as, a commentary on your pitch. And we said, okay, fine. So Bill and I are pitching. And, we've got it all planned out. Who's going to take this part? Who's going to take this part? Where, we've got it all choreographed. And we're pitching our asses off. And we get about halfway through. And Larry, sure enough, goes, excuse me. And he gets up and he goes into the bathroom. And Bill and I kind of look at each other like, think it's going pretty well. I think we're doing okay. No sooner did we say that from behind the bathroom door, we hear, just when you thought it was over, he's just puking his guts out. And it finally mercifully ends. We hear the toilet flush, and Larry comes out and he says, "I don't know about this pitch, but I think I got an episode out of that." And that became part of a Seinfeld episode. Our pitch got rejected. That became part of because that was the year they were doing the show within a show. And that became Bob Balaban's character, who was the NBC executive, having a bad piece of fish. He's not feeling well. He calls Jerry and George over to pitch the show, and they're in the middle of their pitch, and he excuses himself and does that very thing in the bathroom. Jerry and George do the same thing Bill and I did. I think it's going pretty well. And then they hear the vomiting, and he comes out, and I forget how that all ended, but that was inspired. That's how I say whenever I got on Seinfeld, was always by accident. So that wasn't me pitching that. It was just us doing this and that thing happening, and Larry liking that, thinking that was much funnier than what we were pitching. But the very next day, I came back with the movie idea, and I think Larry respected the fact that I didn't get bummed out by that pitch being rejected. And there was something in this idea that he could hook into, and that became the movie. I don't think it's not my favorite episode. I don't think it was a great episode, but we got it on the air, and that's my one full writing credit on Seinfeld.
Now, you're with Raymond for all 9 seasons, right?
Yeah.
How did that come about? Did you know Phil, or you knew Raymond?
I knew Ray
from comedy.
Yeah, I knew Ray from New York.
How did you end up getting that job? Because I know Schneider wrote on that. A lot of guys I knew wrote on that show.
Yeah, I got the job because I was coming off a show called The Home Court, which starred Pamela Reed. It was on NBC. We did 20 episodes, and then it was canceled. And I had gotten that show. I was like the last person hired in Hollywood that year, but I'd gotten on the show, and I'd written spec scripts, and my agent, Kara Stein at William Morris at the time, I guess sent one of my spec scripts to Phil, and she said, "You got to." This is pre-internet, where we lived like animals. I had to actually drive to Beverly Hills to watch a VHS tape of this show called Everybody Loves Raymond. Now, I'd known Ray, but I didn't know he had. I'd lost touch with him because I'd been in LA for a few years, and I didn't know he was acting or anything like that. And it's like, oh, Ray. It's Ray Romano has a show. And I watched the show, and I think it's pretty good. And there's a particular scene in this show that I think is really funny. And so I watched the episode, leave the agency to go have lunch with Phil at Victor's in Los Feliz. And it's the first time meeting Phil. And I talk about the show, and I haven't mentioned the scene that I thought was really, the funny scene and the standout scene. And it was the right thing to say, because little did I know that was something from his life. And it was this famous Fruit of the Month Club scene where Ray gets his parents' Fruit of the Month Club, and they're just overwhelmed by the idea of getting fruit every month. And they turn it into like the worst oppressive thing ever. And it's just a very funny scene. And that's what Phil's parents had done from him when he got them Fruit of the Month Club. What are we going to do with all this fruit? They're just completely ungracious about it. And so I complimented the right scene. And the next day, they said, "You got the job." And so I'd known Ray, but he had nothing to do with me getting the job. And it was the career-making move.
How long do you think it was going to last? Like, you always get that, because I think Lou Schneider, he passed up the Rhea Perlman show to take Raymond, and it all ended up great for you guys. But were the ratings quick out of the gate, or was it a rocky beginning when that show came out?
No, I have a similar story to Lou in that I had 3 job offers that year. It was the last season of Coach, the first 13 of Everybody Loves Raymond, or a show that was on Fox called Homeboys from Outer Space, about 2 young black kids who are in outer space. And I got offers from all 3. And one of my agents, not my main agent at the time, but one of my agents, I not heard great things about Coach and the guy who was going to be running it. And I watched the show, but it was going to be the last season. And I didn't want to be in a show where they'd done all the episodes already. And then Homeboys from Outer Space just wasn't the right fit. And I remember having a conversation, and one of my agents said, "No, but you got to take Coach because that's the guaranteed 22. Raymond is 13. Nobody knows this guy. He's this unknown comedian. He was going to be on Fridays, where CBS hadn't had a hit since Gomer Pyle." And I just made the creative decision. And it turned out to be one of the best. It was the best career decision of my life, which was I just wanted to go on the show where they hadn't done all the episodes. And I heard good things about Phil, and I'd be working with a guy that I knew who was in the same stage of life that I was in, married with children. That was the thing about Seinfeld that I couldn't quite relate to. It was about single people dating in New York, and I was never really single dating in New York, so I didn't have all those stories. But I had plenty of stories about marriage and family. And so I went with that, and we got great critical reviews. That's what helped us, because we were on Friday. Ray would always joke, "We're getting our ass kicked by Moesha," and we were on. It was I forget what we followed, but we were on. It was it was like Urkel. Those kind of shows were on, and us. But we got this critical acclaim, and people could tell the show was well constructed, well conceived. Phil had really kind of put it together very well, and they tried us out on. They picked us up for the back 9, so at least we were going to get 22. And then later in the year, they decided to try us out on Monday because they had these star-driven shows. They had the show with Ted Danson and Mary Steenburgen. They had the second iteration of The Cosby Show. And on Wednesdays, they had this Rhea Perlman show. Excuse me. And these shows weren't doing all that well, especially the Ted Danson show. And so they tried us out on Monday at 8:30, and we did pretty well. And I think we ended the season, like the last 2 or 3 episodes were on Monday at 8:30 in that block that they had. And they decided, oh, this is doing it. We got out of the Friday hellscape and was in their heavily promoted Monday. And that was, we came back for a second season. Eventually moved up to 9 o'clock Monday, and eventually became the anchor of the whole night and really the anchor of the whole network. That after 9 years, they didn't want us to leave. But that's how it happened.
Now, you won 2 Emmys for that show, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys got Best Comedy the last season and 2 before that?
The last season and and we missed a season. I think Arrested Development got it, but we'd gotten the season 4 before that. So 2 out of the last 3 years of the show, we won the Emmy.
Did you think you were going to win an Emmy? I mean, like with that, I mean, it's always a weird thing going to the Emmys. You don't know, especially now. I mean, they say Bear is a comedy, which I like the show Bear, but it's not a comedy.
Yeah.
It's just, but do you remember who you were against, or were you the underdogs that first year?
We were underdogs every year. First of all, we didn't get nominated until about 4 seasons in. And then the first time we won an Emmy was Patty Heaton winning it for acting, I think, in that 4th season. And then the actors were winning Emmys. Doris was winning, I think, won 4, and Brad won 3 or 4, and Ray eventually won 1, Patty won 2. The actors were winning, but the show wasn't. We were losing to Sex and the City. We were losing to Ally McBeal, which, were they comedies or not? I guess Sex and the City you kind of say was, but it certainly wasn't the traditional sitcom. And then there are always hipper shows, the show, what's the show about the gay couples?
Will and Grace.
Will and Grace. We lost to them. We lost to, and then Arrested Development became kind of the fair-haired show. So it was you're always losing to these shows that are either these dramedies or the shows that were considered hipper. And Arrested Development, which is a great show, got no audience. I mean, nobody was watching. Everybody was watching our show, but we weren't winning the awards. And then finally we broke through and won. And then that was, a thrill. And it was particularly a thrill for me because I had invited my parents to the Emmys that year. And they were there when we won our first Emmy. So I was able to share that with them. But the last year, we didn't think we were going to win because we were already off. I mean, we'd already ended our last season. And we figured nobody's going to give it to a show that's going to be off the air because it's not part of the reason they do award shows is to promote future, shows of the future. And so it was, and we thought Arrested Development will win again because they're the hip, edgy show. And lo and behold, we won in the last season. And we'd actually shot our last show in January of that year. It aired in April, our last show. And so, a few months had gone by. We weren't even in the room together anymore. And we ended up winning that last Emmy for the final season, which I think is kind of a rare thing.
So you've also written for other shows after that, but now you have the Substack. Tell me about your Substack page, because I know
Substack,
I know people do it.
No, I appreciate you bringing that up, Coop, because the Substack, right now I'm a little too old and expensive to get on a TV show anymore. And the business is changed so much that it's hard for anybody to get to work. I had lunch with a development executive at ABC yesterday who is saying the same thing. He says, we have one show. She said, we have one show brought on the network. That's it. We don't pick up anything. And she says it's all fear-based. And streaming has changed a lot of the chemistry of the whole thing. But without getting into that, one of the things I've been writing screenplays. So I've been doing that and trying to get those produced. But the other thing that I've been doing is on the platform Substack. If your listeners know, Substack is this publishing platform. A lot of journalists use it. It's subscription based, and it's got a great networking function. And I use it. I put out a piece once a month, and it's a funny story or essay. Sometimes it's just about a subject. Sometimes it's an actual story from my life. You mentioned the Seinfeld shirt story. That's kind of behind the scenes, the Seinfeld story that I tell. And my last one that's up there now is behind the scenes at Raymond story that I tell. But it can be anything like that. So if you go to steveskrovan.substack.com, you can subscribe. It's free. It's only once a month, so it's not going to jam up your inbox. And I call it Bits and Pieces. And it's been a great outlet for me to kind of tell the stories of my life. I said earlier, I started comedy. I wanted to write short stories. But at age 22, I had nothing to write about. Well, now I'm 67. I got plenty to write about. Got a life that I can write about. And so instead of trying to pitch TV shows based on that to no avail, this is the outlet that I'm using.
I have one final question for you. Do you think the sitcom is dead? I mean, when you think about it, I mean, they're like Only Murders in the Building is great. I watched that. That's a good show, and that is, but that's nothing. It's not like there's not the traditional sitcom anymore. Like you came from Seinfeld and Raymond, and then a few other shows you wrote for, Hot in Cleveland, the other one with Jolie Fisher and Brad Garrett.
Well, yeah.
They were sitcoms somewhat. But do you think, because as you said, you're too expensive and you're too old. So, It's funny because you're the guys though that make the sitcoms work. I mean, you have the experience. It's like anything with a baseball team. You want a guy who's a manager who knows what he's doing. But
Yeah.
do you think, as a writer and someone who's been in the industry for so long, do you think the sitcom is dead?
No, it may take different forms. It comes in different formats. The sitcom that we know was developed in the 50s. Was I Love Lucy, and it was filmed in front of an audience because that's what they knew how to do. They knew it was a theatrical experience. And so shows like Raymond, Seinfeld was kind of a hybrid of pre-shoot stuff that was more cinematic, but also done in front of an audience. And all those shows of the 80s and 90s and 70s all the way through were these all based on that I Love Lucy model or Honeymooners model, which is in front of a live audience, which was all these performers were used to doing because they all came from theater and the writers all came from theater. And now you've got the single camera shows, which are basically little, 22-minute movies or 45-minute movies. And it will never die. It'll just take different forms because that's how they're, metabolizing their experience in life is through laughter. So there'll always be different. So I don't know whether a sitcom like Raymond or a sitcom like Cosby in that format will ever reign supreme again. Part of it will be the economics. If that's the more economical thing to do, if that'll happen. If it's more economical to block and shoot something like a movie, that will maintain. But it will never be dead. I mean, people always say, I've had this my entire 40-some plus year career where people say, oh, it's good to laugh, especially in this day and age. Every year of my life, I've heard somebody say that. Like there was an age where nobody needed to laugh, You know what? I'm good. I don't need to laugh anymore. Middle ages. Oh, it's good. No, it's good because people are dying of the plague. Especially in this day and age. People always need to laugh, and people like me who are lucky enough to be able to kind of step in front of the parade and entertain people either through stand-up or through writing will always emerge to kind of point out the ironies and hopefully ease the pain of living. That will always be there.
Well, this has been awesome, Steve. I'm so glad we got to do this. Now, how can people get in touch with you? You have the Substack, and people, it's Skrovan. It's Skrovan.
Yes. The best way is go to steveskrovan.substack.com. You can leave a comment. I also do an audio version of every story. So that's kind of like my being able to do stand-up without having to go out to a club and do it. So I do an audio version. Sometimes the audio versions are fun because I add sound effects or different kinds of music effects that are different from reading it. A lot of people just like to read it. Other people can listen to it, so you can listen to it in the car. It's, it'll be 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes tops. But I really encourage people to go to steveskrovan.substack.com because that's where I'm having the most fun right now.
Well, that was awesome. People, so go check them out. I want to give a shout out to Jimmy Corin and the Comedy Trainwreck for producing the show. They're a great little network. Follow them on YouTube. They have a bunch of shows. Ed McGonigal's show, Corey Alexander, Coleman Green and Katrina Braxton, and I think Gene Norris. Also, you can go to listen to my other show, CooperTalk.net. I have over 1,020 episodes. I've interviewed over 65 members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Lots of great TV writers, great actors. If you go to YouTube on my business show, The Coop Tank, you can check that out. So once again, I want to thank my guest, Steve Skrovan. And people, I will talk to you next week with another great guest. Have a good night.
Coop's Comedy Corner.